Yes, would you ask Dr. Lane to come back in, please? Thank you. Hi, Dr. Lane. Ready to carry on?
Yeah.
Very good, thank you. Yes, Mr. Elliott, when you're ready.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Dr. Lane, at day 137, page 123, paragraphs 5 to 11, Mr. Stokes accepted in his evidence that in the 5 fire risk assessments that he conducted for Grenfell Tower between 2010 and 2016, he never identified and considered disabled residents or occupants especially at risk. Now, if that is correct, as he says, was that failure to identify any vulnerable residents consistent with your expectations of what a reasonably competent fire risk assessor should have done?
No.
Thank you. Would you expect the competent advisor within the responsible person to note that there were time and again, for a period of years, no specific disabled residents or occupants at risk identified in any of those fire risk assessments?
Yes.
Yes. And would you expect the competent person within the responsible person to ask the fire risk assessor to correct the fire risk assessment in that respect or to do further work?
Yes, and particularly when the risk assessment tackles it in writing.
Yes.
Particularly so.
Particularly so.
Yeah.
Thank you, yes. Can I then turn to the assessment of the emergency plan at Grenfell Tower,
Yeah.
such as it was? And you've covered this topic at Chapter 9 in your report at BLARP 25028, and particularly Section 1
Yeah.
on pages 5 to 8 of that. In very simple terms, is it your opinion that Article 15 of the RRO
Yeah.
imposes the basic obligation on the responsible person to have an emergency plan for its building?
That's my understanding based on reading, I think it's particularly the enforcement guide. So I've had to refer to other
Yes.
documents to be clear on that.
Yes, and you've said
Yeah.
so. And when you say enforcement guide, what do you mean?
Oh, sorry. I mean the document issued by the ODPM in 2007.
Right, so the DCLG guide to the RRO.
Yes, sorry, excuse me. Yeah, I have given the correct reference in my report. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and other documents I've had to rely
yes.
on, and I've set them all out in the big table in Chapter 9.
You have, and one of those documents, I think, is the sleeping guide.
Yes.
Yes. Can we look at that? RBK 3036722, page 36. And at page 36, we find section 4.2 of the sleeping guide. And if we look at that, at the very bottom of your screen, it says emergency plans. You need to have an emergency plan for dealing with any fire situation. The purpose of an emergency plan is to ensure that people know what to do if there's a fire and that the premises can be safely evacuated.
Yeah.
And you quote that, in fact, in your report at paragraphs 2.2.5 at BLARP 25028, page 9. Presumably, well, let me ask it this way. Was that a principle which, so far as you are aware, was in common currency but in the years 2010 to 2017?
In common currency.
Well, commonly understood.
So you know that I work in lots of different sectors. So the emergency plan is whatever common currency, as you say, in many of the sectors that I work.
Right. And is it right that the findings from a fire risk assessment are a key driver or influence of what should go into an emergency plan as contemplated here?
Sorry, can you just say that again, that the findings of the risk assessment?
Yes.
Yes, they're inextricably linked, yes.
And is it right, or is it your understanding, that an emergency plan had to be building specific?
Yes.
Yes. And documented?
Yes.
In all of your work producing your report, did you see any evidence of an emergency plan such as we've just been discussing as contemplated by the sleeping guide for Grenfell Tower?
In the context, no, I did not. No.
Yeah. Now, just pausing there, would it be normal practice for a responsible person to have no emergency plan at all
At
for
all.
a building.
No.
Can I then turn to the question of Grenfell Tower itself, whether it was a simple building or a complex building?
Yeah.
Can we start again with the LGA guide? I say again, go back to the LGA guide, HAOM 45964, page 118. Can we go to paragraph 79.1? This is under the heading Preparing for Emergencies. And 79.1 says this: it is a requirement of the FSO that there should be a suitable emergency plan for the premises.
Yeah.
Rarely, in purpose-built blocks of flats, will it be necessary to have a more elaborate emergency plan than a simple fire action notice. See Appendix 5 for examples. Nor will it be universally necessary to display such notices. Indeed, it is more common not to display notices, but to convey this information to tenants in other ways, e.g. through residence handbooks and so forth. Now, in terms of the responsibilities in relation to the emergency plan, first, was it your understanding that the responsible person should prepare and maintain that plan?
Or employ someone to do so? Yes.
Yes. And was it then the fire risk assessor's task to review the suitability of that plan as part of their fire risk assessment?
Yes, or they might even be asked to they might be scoped to write it. Yeah.
Yes.
And that's a contractual matter, though.
Yes,
Yeah.
indeed. And then if we go to page 120 in this document, can we look at paragraph 79.12, just next to the premises information box, or rather the photograph of it? It says this: in large, more complex blocks of flats, it can be of great assistance to the fire and rescue service to keep plans on the premises, detailing information on the layout of the building and its services.
Yeah.
This can be helpful at the time of an incident in dealing with the emergency.
Yeah.
Again, use of a premises information box at the main entrance is one way to achieve this.
Yeah.
Now, you can see the reference to large, more complex blocks of flats.
Yeah.
Was there an accepted or common definition of, or standard of what is a complex block? Or was that simply a matter of fact and degree for the judgment of the fire risk assessor and the responsible person?
I think back then, so before the fire, I would have said it was, it's not something I thought about very often. I think back then, I probably imagined it was judgment. I think I have to be honest that I've learnt in the last few years that there's some complex views around the subject. But it's not something that I came up against, let's say, before Grenfell.
Right.
Okay.
To the best of your knowledge and understanding and experience, how would an average fire risk assessor reading 79.12 know whether the building with which they were confronted was a more complex block of flats? What makes it more complex?
What makes it more complex? So I think I've set that out a few times, actually. I think in module 2 and again in this module. Complexity is a function of the systems made available in the building for protection, if there's more than sleeping risk, and also it's also a function of the occupancy profile of the building. So all the standard issues that have to be contemplated in fire safety, either during design or in occupation, when carrying out a risk assessment as well. So they're like the classic protection, the classic occupancy profile issues. That's how you work out a building is complex or not. And I've set out a list of things. I just can't remember it off by heart right now. I did provide a list of really specific things.
We'll look at part of that in a moment. Before I do, can I just ask you to be showing what Mr. Todd said in his evidence?
Yeah.
At day 167, if we can please turn that up, page 144, line 9. I'll just show you what he said.
Yeah. Line 9.
Line 9.
Yeah.
He said, there isn't a definition of complex block of flats, but I wouldn't have regarded it, that's Grenfell Tower, as complex, and here's the reason why. From the fire brigade attender's point of view, and this is what it's talking about here, could the fire brigade easily get disorientated with multiple staircases, corridors off corridors and so on, and so plans would help them.
Yeah.
Floor plan on every floor of the uppermost floors of Grenfell Tower simply repeated, and it was a very simple layout, and there was a single staircase and a single lift. There was a smoke control system, which you get in blocks of flats, but I wouldn't have called it a complex building, sir.
Okay.
No, you wouldn't. Not for the purpose of this paragraph, no.
Yeah. So I understand the additional, like the points Mr. Todd has raised there that don't apply to the physical layout of Grenfell Tower. I agree that they introduce complexity. I mean, you know, it may be because I found it so incredibly difficult to work out lots of the systems and things that were installed in Grenfell Tower that I can't agree. The smoke control system is incredibly complex and was provided with all sorts of interventions by the brigade that I've explained that I don't think are simple. I understand there's a single staircase, but for example, it's not in the typical arrangement. You know, the riser isn't in the classic position. There's a few other things like that. I understand that lots of people consider blocks of flats simple. I understand that, but my opinion is that I can't share that opinion any longer.
Now, can we look at Chapter 9 of your report, BLARP 250/28, page 14. And on page 14, let's look at paragraph 2.2.23.
Yeah.
And you say here, Grenfell Tower was a high-rise building with a shared single means of egress and multiple occupancy types, residential and non-residential. The emergency plan for such a building would cover the residential portion of the building on upper levels, as well as the commercial tenancies on the lower levels, including a boxing club and a nursery. Grenfell Tower was provided with a complex smoke control system, and its occupancy profile contained residents who required assistance in the event of a fire, as well as non-residents and other relevant persons.
Yeah.
On this basis, as I've set out before in my Phase 2 Module 1 report, under Regulation 38, I would consider Grenfell Tower to be a complex building, and I review the requirements for the emergency plan accordingly.
Yeah.
Just to be crystal clear, are the factors that you've set out there, paragraphs 2.2.23 and 2.2.24, the factors that in your view make Grenfell Tower a more complex block for the purposes of the LGA guide?
Oh, for the purposes of the LGA guide.
Which refers to more complex buildings, as we've seen.
I think they're the parameters I consider to make it complex, yes.
In your opinion, could a building with the profile you've identified here ever be considered a simple building?
Well, I've told you, I think other people think that's simple, but I mean,
You don't agree?
I don't.
You don't.
I think I've made that point. Yeah.
Now, Janice Ray told us that she didn't think, or she didn't agree, that Grenfell Tower was a complex building.
Yeah.
She said that it was never considered a complex building as a result of a fire risk assessment, and not considered to be complex by the LFB either. That was her evidence.
Okay.
My question is, in your opinion, would it be apparent to the reasonable, competent advisor within the responsible person that Grenfell Tower was a complex building?
So I don't understand that point that you've relayed back to me, because my understanding is that Miss Ray, in consultation with Mr. Stokes and the enforcing authority, created a list of high-risk buildings in the wider KCTMO portfolio, and I don't understand why that doesn't mean some element of complexity.
I follow.
Okay, they split their portfolio into three, and they placed Grenfell Tower into high risk. So, in my mind, we've entered into a space of complexity.
I see.
Okay.
Do you criticise Mr. Stokes for not concluding that Grenfell Tower was a complex building, and therefore advising the TMO that a comprehensive emergency plan should be developed?
Oh, I see what you mean. Yes, but I mean, having read everything, it just was never something that was even contemplated over the years.
Yes.
Okay, so it's not relevant to Grenfell, but theoretically, if a client hands you the list of high-risk properties on their portfolio, and you see some of the features here I've listed, I think it's reasonable to place it into the complex category.
And on that basis, do you criticise Mr Stokes for not advising the TMO that they should have a comprehensive emergency plan for Grenfell Tower?
Owen, well, I think he should have advised them that they needed an emergency plan anyway. Probably I wanted to be more precise that way.
Right.
Yeah.
And you say that regardless of whether it was complex.
Yeah, because the kind of format and contents of the emergency plan then change as a function of simple up to complex. My understanding of particularly the guidance is not you do emergency plan if the building is complex and you don't do anything at all if it's simple. I don't understand that to be the case. The detail you have to get into is what changes.
For what kind of building would you reasonably not do an emergency plan?
I can't imagine any building where you wouldn't have to have some thought having gone into what happens in the event of a fire.
Then turning to the question of the format of an emergency plan, you've covered that, I think, in Chapter 9 of your report at page 30. You've referred there to Annex G of PAS 7.
Oh, yes.
2013.
Yeah.
Let's just look at that, so just have it on the screen so people can see what we're talking about. It's BSI 6071, page 39. And this is Annex G of PAS 7 from 2013. Would you expect both the responsible person, perhaps through the competent advisor, and the fire risk assessor to be familiar with this template here, Annex G?
Yeah, so I would never criticise anyone about a template. I've said that before, okay? But I think there's all sorts of documents make clear the emergency plan is a duty for the responsible person. And this, I think actually this is kind of a helpful pro forma. If one wasn't sure what to do, it offers you some help, along with the big list and the HM sleeping guide particularly. Yeah.
And would you expect the competent advisor within the responsible person and the fire risk assessor to be familiar with the guide and at least the principle of having an emergency plan as indicated by Annex G here?
So do you mean, do I think they should have been familiar with PAS 7 expressly?
Yes.
I mean, I'm probably aware that it wasn't so well used, okay? But I don't think that detracts from knowing about the duty to have some form of emergency plan.
Now, can we then turn to the TMO's emergency plan itself?
Yeah.
And you've covered that in Chapter 9 of your report.
Yeah.
If we look at it, it's at TMO 1001 3898. Let's just have that up, please, on the screen. TMO 1001 3898. Well, that is the first page. And to remind people of its dates, can we go to page 3? Version 1, you'll see, was produced in August 2004.
Yeah.
And then there were later revisions in May 2009, May 2015, and February 2016.
Yeah.
And there's an index on page 5, if we can then switch to that. You'll see that there.
Yeah.
And then on pages 13 to 14, we just look at that. You can see from 13 and 14, you can see that there's an emergency plan which sets out guidance on how the emergency plan can be found and used.
Yeah.
And you'll note that the first part of that, after the introduction, KCTMO emergency plan, deals with what the KCTMO should do in the event of a major incident,
Yeah.
which is defined, and a major emergency, which is also defined.
Yeah.
And then if we turn to page 17, there's a diagram with a cascade 1, for key individuals to be contacted in the event of an emergency. And on page 19, you can see there's a cascade 2,
Yeah.
about what happens outside normal working hours and who contacts whom, and
Yeah.
the rotas, etc. And some individuals, the names of whom are now fairly familiar to people. Just looking at the overall nature of this document and the date of its original creation in 2004,
Yeah.
which I think is this right? It's before the RRO came into force.
Yeah.
Do you have an opinion about whether it was prepared in compliance with the RRO or for some other purpose?
Well, I tried very hard to work out if it had features of a plan that was relevant to communicating matters in the event of a fire, and I wasn't able to conclude that as I set out in Chapter 9. And in the end, I decided it was for other purposes, yes, but it's for others to,
Indeed.
make that view, give that view.
Yes. If we go to page 145, we can see a specific entry, if I can call it that,
Yeah.
for Grenfell Tower.
Yeah.
You can see it there,
Yeah.
Lancaster West, and there's some detail about that.
Yeah.
Number of dwellings, 120, numbers of residents,
Yeah.
and other matters you can see there. At page 146, it continues.
Yeah.
You're familiar with this?
Oh, yeah, incredibly familiar
Yeah.
with it. Yeah.
And you've noted in your report at paragraph 8.2.17 at BLARP 250 28, page 92, that this entry was not updated after the completion of the refurbishment in July 2016,
Yeah.
or indeed before that.
Yeah.
Now, this is laying the groundwork. Janice Ray was asked if the emergency plan was intended to be building specific
Yeah.
for Grenfell. And what she said, and it's day 142,
Yeah.
page 43, lines 22 to 25, I'll just recite it to you. She said it was intended to collate relevant information that the emergency services or anybody else would require. So it was meant to be a source of information and contribute to emergency planning. That's how she described
Okay.
this document.
Yeah.
In your opinion, did this emergency plan, such as it was for Grenfell Tower, collate relevant information necessary for the Fire and Rescue Service to respond to a fire at Grenfell Tower?
Oh, yeah. So it had some pieces of information, and some of those pieces of information were obsolete the night of the fire. And I didn't find any evidence of it being, let's say, a working document or a communication, a document to communicate with the brigade before the fire, because there was a formal, again, a really productive system available to the KCTMO where they were meeting the brigade in various forms. It was meant to be, I think it's every 2 months or so. So I did look again to see how this document was used and kept up to date in that context as well, and I didn't find any evidence of it.
Right. Did these pages of this document relating to Grenfell Tower, in your opinion, satisfy the requirement of Article 15 of the RRO?
No.
Now let's then look at Carl Stokes' assessment. Can we go to past 79 again, please? CTA 703, this time page 90, section 25.4. And we can see on that page, this is part of the template, and making all allowances for what you've said so far about templates. You can see here that there is a section on appropriate fire procedures in place.
Yeah.
And there's some questions that are set out, 6 questions are procedures in the event of fire, appropriate and properly documented, etc. Looking at those questions, would it be normal and accepted practice for a fire risk assessor to examine the arrangements for an emergency plan for a building which he was assessing by reference to this list?
I think it's a very helpful list. Yes. Yeah. Or if he had an extended list, or he went to one of the longer lists in the sleeping guide. But yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And similarly, would it be normal practice or good practice, let's say, for a fire risk assessor to check that there was a documented emergency plan recording these arrangements?
Yes, I think so. Yes. Oh, sorry, I should have just said yes.
Yes, and also to check that there are adequate procedures for evacuation of any disabled people likely to be present, which is the last question set out there.
Yes.
Yes. And would failure to do any of those things, to assess, to document, or to check there was a document, and to make the check for disabled people, be consistent with reasonable competence?
To failure to do so, it's not consistent with reasonable competence. And not knowing the answer to those questions, or not having been able to find or not have read documents that allowed you to answer those questions, impacts your ability to conclude on a risk level. That's the more important point, if you will.
Yes. And do you agree that this text in this guidance tells the fire risk assessor, regardless of PEEPs, that the approach set out here was that there did need to be procedures in place for the evacuation of any disabled people identified as likely to be present?
Yeah, that's my understanding. Yeah.
And was it your understanding that the approach in PAS 79 was that these procedures were not simply reliance on the fire and rescue service to get people out of the building, but procedures to be put in place by the responsible person?
Yes.
Yes. And the presence and adequacy of those procedures in place, if they were in place, fell for assessment by the fire risk assessor?
Yes.
And on the evidence that you've seen, can you tell us what were the TMO's procedures for the evacuation of disabled residents of Grenfell Tower as contemplated by that final question on that page there?
In practice, nothing. As documented in the risk assessment, something different. The language in the risk assessment.
By which do you mean the reference to the TP tracker?
Yeah, and disability, and there was a section. So because the risk assessment is a formal document and the emergency plan emanates from it. But my understanding, having reviewed all the evidence, is there was no procedure at all.
Thank you. Now, can we then go? Yes, can we then go, please, to Carl Stokes' FRA for the 20th of June 2016, his last one, CST 403145, page 5. And on page 5, under the heading Evacuation Strategy for this building, he says this, and I'll read it all to you. It's a bit long, but please bear with me. For the residents of this building, there is a stay-put evacuation strategy. This means the residents can remain within their own dwelling during a fire incident in this building, unless the fire is in their dwelling or that their dwelling is otherwise affected by the fire, in which case they should immediately evacuate their dwelling and call the fire and rescue service. The fire service or TMO employees will arrange for a general evacuation of the whole building at any time if this is appropriate to do so. Alternatively, the resident can leave their dwelling at any time if we turn the page, they so wish to do so. TMO has provided information to all residents in tenants' handbooks via letters and briefing sheets of what to do in the event of an emergency, and articles on fire safety advice and emergency procedures are included in the residents' magazine called Link. Also, articles are provided reminding tenants that they must not store items in communal areas nor cause obstructions to the means of escape. These articles are produced in the 7 major languages which have been selected as being the most likely to meet the needs of the residents. The landlord relies upon the tenants to respond to any emergency in accord with agreed emergency plans and does not facilitate any fire drills in other emergency evacuation exercises. In the residential area of this building, there have been no fires in the last 2 years, apart from the burnt cooking toast incident in the last week of September 2014. The fire service were called to this 10th floor level flat by the occupant. As far as I know, no firefighting action was taken by the fire service. I have been told, and there is no known problems with false alarms from the domestic detectors installed within the individual dwellings. And then he's got a section for other areas of the building that you can see there. The contractors will have an evacuation policy, and he's got something about the nursery and boxing club having their own FRAs. Now, in evidence, Carl Stokes told us, and for our purposes, this is day 136, page 215, lines 20 to 25, that this section of his FRA that I've just read to you, his fire risk assessment that I've just read to you, would contain the specific evacuation strategy for Grenfell Tower in two parts, one for the residential areas and one for the commercial or retail areas. Now, that was his evidence. In your view, Dr. Lane, bearing in mind the nature of the obligation and the guidance we've looked at, did Carl Stokes' assessment of the emergency plan for Grenfell Tower, as set out here, meet the standards expected of a competent fire risk assessor?
No, it didn't, because it's inaccurate. It's an inaccurate description of the arrangements made.
Inaccurate.
Well, you need, if you just go back,
Can we turn back to page 5?
I think maybe, do you mean if this, just this page could be considered a compliant emergency plan if it contained accurate information?
Well, we've agreed, I think there was nothing else that you've seen by way of an emergency plan.
Exactly. And then this information is also incorrect.
Right.
Because of the offer of the general evacuation of the whole building, and I found no procedures to enable that.
Now, I want to turn to a totally different topic, which is lifts. And can I begin with Mr. Stokes' understanding of lifts as firefighting lifts in the face of, well, in the context of the information that he was given?
Yeah.
This is where we're going.
Yeah.
Now, in your Phase 1 report, at Appendix L, I'll just give the reference, it's BLAS 6033, but also in paragraph 12.2.4 of Chapter 8 of your Phase 2 FRA report, BLARP 250 27252, you set out your conclusions, I think, on the degree to which the lifts at Grenfell Tower did or did not conform to the applicable standards.
Yeah.
What I want to try to do is summarise your view, if I can,
Okay, yeah.
briefly, and just tell me if you agree with this summary. First, is it right that your view is that although the passenger lifts complied to the lower standard of fire lift defined by CP3 1971, they were not firefighting lifts?
It's my understanding they were not firefighting lifts.
And that they didn't conform to the standards required by BS 55885 of 2004 and BS EN 8172.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
And because, for example, there was no escape hatch or dual power supply.
Yeah, particularly because of the dual power supply.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, and as a result, it's your view, I think, that the lower level of protection afforded by a fire lift meant that they must not be used for human transport during a fire.
Yes.
Yes, and therefore it would follow that fire lifts, such as those at Grenfell Tower, should not have been relied upon for the evacuation of residents within any evacuation strategy.
That's correct.
Thank you. Now, let's then look against that background of summary of your view at Mr. Stokes' June 2016 fire risk assessment. Go back to where we were, page 5, CST 403145, page 5. We looked at this a moment ago. We'll come back to it. He says there, 5 lines up from the bottom of the box, he says,
Sorry, where are we now? Are we still on this page?
yes.
Okay, yep.
Yes.
Sorry, I can see it now. Apologies.
Yes. And you can see what he says there.
Yeah.
He says the two lifts in this building
Yeah.
both are evacuation stroke firefighting lifts.
Yes.
Now, he says the same thing in all of his FRAs for
Yes.
Grenfell Tower, despite the fact that he'd noted the absence of an escape hatch.
Yes, and that he had been told a few other times in writing that they weren't.
As well.
Yeah.
Now, can I just pin this down with precision in your report? Can we go to your report at Chapter 8, BLARP 25027, page 258, and let's look together at paragraph 12.2.52.
Yeah.
You say there, after reciting paragraph 119 of Mr. Stokes's witness statement,
Yeah.
at figure 12.3, you say, the absence of a roof hatch is a key indicator a lift is not a firefighting lift and was a requirement of BSEN 8172/2003 as I've presented in chapter 7 of this report. You say key indicator. Would you expect the reasonably competent fire risk assessor during the period 2010 to 2017 to know that the absence of a hatch meant that these lifts could not be described as firefighting lifts in his FRAs?
Yes.
He would. And therefore also couldn't be used for evacuation of occupants, disabled or otherwise.
Yes.
And if you go on to page 260, 2 pages on in this, you go on to say, at paragraphs 12.2.67, under the heading, the resulting failures in Mr. Stokes's advice and assessment of risk to the relevant persons, you say, Mr. Stokes's continued description of the lifts as firefighting and evacuation lifts, noting it is very unusual for an evacuation lift to be present, even in a modern high-rise building in London, creates a skewed impression of fire risk control within the building, as the fire risk assessment referred to an active fire protection measure that did not, in fact, exist.
Yes. Yeah.
We've heard from Mr. Stokes that he believed that the lifts at Grenfell Tower were firefighting lifts and that they would satisfy the requirements for evacuation lifts. Was that belief a significant error or a minor error?
It's, as I've explained, I think it's a significant error.
Was it an error which, in your opinion, would prevent the fire risk assessment from being considered suitable and sufficient, at least to that extent?
Yes, I would.
Now, Mr. Todd has said that it's a minor error in the context of a suitable and sufficient FRA. And to be clear, that's at paragraph 2.69 of his main report at page 18, CTA 5011, page 18.
Okay.
What do you say about that?
Well, can I understand, did he think the minor error was not knowing it was a firefighting lift, or that non-firefighting lifts are appropriate for the evacuation of people in the event of a fire?
The former.
Just not knowing the type of lift it was?
Yes.
And he still thought it was a minor error when a risk assessor goes on to rely on it for evacuation. That's Mr. Todd's
Well,
view.
that's
Sorry.
that might
Because
be a very
that's
good question.
there's a very important distinction there. Yeah. So I'm afraid I do prefer if Mr. Todd speaks for himself.
Well, indeed,
Yeah.
and that's very fair. Let's then show you what he said in specifically. Day one, can we have up, please? Day 137, page 183,
Yeah.
line 14. Sorry, this is Mr. Stokes' oral evidence.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, can we just, because we flip between those two people a lot, which I wasn't expecting.
No, that's my fault
Yeah.
this time for confusing the two. But Mr. Stokes' oral evidence, first of all.
Okay, so sorry, can we back up? Is it Mr. Stokes says it's a minor error?
I am showing you Mr. Todd says it's a minor error, and Mr. Stokes, it's based on what Mr. Stokes says. And I'm going to show you what Mr. Stokes says, then I'm going to show you what Mr. Todd says.
Okay.
Because of the way you answered the question and needed some help, so I'm going to
Okay,
help you by
understood.
showing
Apologies.
all the material.
Yeah.
Now, at day 137, page 183, line 14,
Yeah.
Mr. Stokes says, well, I put to him this. Mr. Todd says in his report that you made an incorrect assumption that these lifts could be used for the purposes of firefighting or evacuation. We can see it if you like. Do you agree with him? No. Why is that? Because under the definition of a firefighting lift and an evacuation lift, these lifts could be used for both these purposes. Question, do you accept that your statement that these were firefighting evacuation lifts would have misled the reader of this document who wanted to know the evacuation strategy for disabled persons in Grenfell Tower? No. Question, you don't accept, I imagine, also that your statements posed a risk to life to anyone who sought to use them in that way? No. So that was his evidence. Now let's see what Mr. Todd said about his evidence. First of all, can I show you his main report, CTA 6011, page 18, paragraph 2.69. Conclusions. This is general. Any shortcomings in the FRAs carried out by Mr. Stokes are, in my opinion, quite minor in the overall context of a suitable and sufficient FRA. The obvious exception is a statement that would imply that the cladding at Grenfell Tower satisfied the requirements of the building regulations in 2010, etc. A further exception is Mr. Stokes' assumption that the lifts were firefighting lifts, which is likely to have resulted from an assumption based on information originally agreed between Salvus and the TMO in 2009, while not taking into account a change in the position of the TMO senior lift engineer in relation to these lifts in 2011. So he accepts that lifts were an exception to what he says about the character of the error. Now, if we look at his evidence to the inquiry orally, can we go please to day 167? Page 180. Day 167, page 180. If we go, please, to, I'm sorry, the bottom of page 179, which is where the passage I think I need starts. I've shown him paragraph 8.68 of his report, where I quote to him at line 22, I do acknowledge that because Mr. Stokes believed that the lifts at Grenfell Tower were firefighting lifts, he did incorrectly assume that they would satisfy the requirements for evacuation lifts, which are lifts, we go over the page, designed to be suitable for the evacuation of disabled people in the event of fire, but are usually found in commercial buildings rather than blocks of flats where no evacuation lift operator is normally available. That's correct, sir. Question, yes. Was that belief you've identified there a significant error? Much less than you might think, sir, and the reason is that the TMO never had any intention of sending people to evacuate residents via the lifts. That's one reason. The second reason is that in practice you don't get evacuation lifts in blocks of flats anyway, and perhaps one of the most important reasons that it's not as significant as you might think at first sight is that if a resident leaves their flat because there's a fire in their flat, they can actually use a standard passenger lift to leave the building. And he goes on to say, now that sounds wrong because, and there's some background to that about the Fire Brigades Union and some history about drafting the LGA guide. My question is, let's break it up in the way which having shown you the background. First, was it a significant error or a minor error for Mr. Stokes to believe that the lifts at Grenfell Tower were firefighting lifts?
It was a significant error for Mr. Stokes not to have made it his proper business to know which lift was installed in Grenfell Tower.
And secondly, was it a minor error or a significant error for Mr. Stokes to believe that the lifts at Grenfell Tower could be used to evacuate residents in the event of a fire?
Did you give me major and minor, was it? It's a major...
Or significant.
Oh, sorry, significant. It's a significant error that Mr. Stokes communicated in his risk assessment the lifts were safe to use for an evacuation.
Now, let's look at Mr. Stokes' second witness statement, moving this on a little bit further. This is at CST 30300186. And it's his second witness statement. I'd like to look with you at page 25, paragraph 99, little Roman 1. And he says in the beginning of paragraph 99, I did not, so far as I can recall, request further or indeed any independent information regarding the lifts. This was because, 1, the lifts were in situ, having been installed in 2005, and therefore would have had received building control sign-off in 2005 as compliant with the functional requirements of the building regulations. This would be so even though they were being installed as lifts in an existing building, or classed as being modified, as opposed to being new lifts in new buildings in 2005. Now, you can see that...
I think that just doesn't have any meaning to me.
Well, my question was, is what Mr. Stokes said there, a valid assumption?
No.
Now, if we go to your report, in fact, I'm not sure we need to go to it, I can just cite it. You say in Chapter 8 of your report at page 258 of BLARP 250/27, paragraph 12.2.49, that Mr. Stokes made no assessment of the compliance status of these lifts during his FRA work at Grenfell Tower at any time.
Yeah.
My question is, what kind of assessment would you have expected Mr. Stokes to have made?
There, you can derive a very simple checklist. I mean, I think I've put it into both of my reports.
Yes.
And ask, you can derive a very simple checklist, and so take the dual power supply. There is probably one drawing you need to check. But remember, Mr. Stokes had been told there was no secondary power supply for that lift. So even if he hadn't decided to assess it himself, he was told anyway.
Would it lie within the field of competence of an otherwise reasonably competent fire risk assessor embarking on their task to undertake a review of compliance of any element of the building, including in particular lifts, for the purposes of the building regulations?
Well, they either, depending on the year, you either have some helpful information, so you don't have to do too much work. But in the case of Grenfell Tower, where it had all the characteristics of a fire lift, I think the standards that explain fire lifts and the standards that explain firefighting lifts are helpful for you to, even on the process of elimination, notice some of the features don't exist. If you don't feel you're capable of doing that, as a minimum, you should write down, I don't know what type of lift is installed in this building. Someone competent needs to confirm that, and therefore I'm not going to say it's safe to use in the event of a fire, if that's all you're capable of doing.
Right, thank you. Now, if Mr. Stokes had proceeded on the assumption, work on this hypothesis, if Mr. Stokes was proceeding on the assumption that the lifts at Grenfell Tower were firefighting lifts because they had been, as he thought, replaced in 2005, and therefore assumed that they were compliant with the building regulations, would that have been a valid assumption? If you had made the assumption that the lifts in Grenfell Tower had been replaced in 2005 and therefore were firefighting lifts in order to be compliant, would that be a valid assumption?
Just to make that assumption
Yes.
in an existing building?
Yes.
Well, was it valid? I don't think so. I mean, don't the facts kind of speak for themselves? I mean, it's a dangerous assumption to make.
It's a dangerous assumption.
Yeah, because my harsh experience is then it turns out that you're wrong.
Yeah.
So I think it's dangerous to make, because the fire lift is distinct from the firefighting lift. Remember, there's another thing they tend not to be able to do, which is to return to ground in the event of a fire. Okay, so for me anyway, when it comes to lifts, I do think you need to be careful because they can cause other issues in the event of a fire. But people might classify me as cautious, but I think you should know.
Yes, I think. Thank you. And if the passenger lifts at Grenfell Tower, as a matter of fact, were not replaced but were refurbished, what then?
It's the same. Well, if you've made it your business to discover they've only been refurbished and not replaced, your confidence in them needs to be even lower.
Even lower.
Yeah.
Right, thank you very much. Now then, let's turn to the question of the testing of the firefighting switch. I'm trying to cut a long story short here, but the FRA pro forma produced by Mr. Stokes was amended so as to provide that the monthly testing, which was suggested by the PAS 79
Yeah.
template, became monthly inspection.
Yeah.
So instead of testing as recommended in PAS 79, he amended that and put in inspection instead.
Yes. Yeah.
Concerning fire lifts, in what ways would inspection differ from testing?
He removes. So in my mind, as took place. Well, so an inspection requires a competent person in the lift world, as opposed, competent. Sorry, that sounds. A competent lift contractor. There's a whole series of duties in the lift standards. The testing of the lift switch, which is actually cited as weekly, not monthly in modern standards, is a relatively simple, is a simpler task. So I can't do a lift inspection.
Right.
I'm not qualified to do so. I can ask for a lift. I prefer someone else to do the lift test because I've been stuck in lifts too often, but I like to witness the lift test being done. I'm not capable of doing a lift inspection.
I think you used the word test and inspection interchangeably
When?
just now.
Oh, that's probably because so the test is of the switch.
Right.
The inspection is of the lift and there's all different parts of it.
I see. So,
Okay, the lift equipment.
to be fair to
Yeah.
Mr. Stokes, is it in fact the case that he strengthened the standards suggested by the PAS 79 template by upgrading the monthly testing to monthly inspection?
I don't know what Mr. Stokes meant by inspection as distinct from test.
Right.
Okay, because just to get a bit back to the relevance of for Grenfell Tower, as I've set out at length, I don't know that anyone tested the switch to the lift, which is the main duty in terms of for a fire risk assessment.
Now, can I show you what Mr. Todd says in his main report about this topic? It says at CTA 6011, page 89. And at paragraph 8.81, Mr. Todd says, I am unclear as to why Mr. Stokes omitted any reference to weekly testing. Weekly testing. It might be that he considered this frequency of testing was somewhat impracticable and unnecessary in the case of a block of flats as opposed to a commercial building, in which case I would agree with his view. Weekly testing is included in the PAS 79 template simply because it is recommended in other standards. Two questions I have for you, Dr. Lane, on that. If weekly testing of the lift override switch is recommended by other standards, such as the LGA guide, and indeed by PAS 79 itself, by inclusion in the template, was the fact that Mr. Stokes was assessing blocks of flats any reasonable basis for excluding it?
No, and particularly because the British standard fire lifts, which gives the most coherent information, the most recent one says a weekly test and then an annual, I'm going to use the word, this is my word, major inspection.
Yes, I see.
Okay. The monthly inspection in the latest standard is actually about testing. The monthly activity is actually about testing if the secondary power supply, the lift can do what it needs to do in secondary power mode. So I'm not sure that I can agree the intention was to make things more robust by switching from weekly to monthly.
No. And do you agree at all with Mr. Todd's view that it's impracticable and unnecessary to test the override switch weekly in a block of flats as opposed to a commercial building?
No, I don't. I don't agree.
Now, in his oral evidence, Mr. Todd explained, and this is at day 167, page 189, lines 8 to 13, that it was his view that the British standard was, quote, unduly onerous in asking for weekly testing. quotes, and merely increased the wear and tear on the switch. Would you agree with that?
No, I wouldn't.
Why not?
Yeah, why do I not agree? Okay, so can I just say a few things about that? If I was working in a building and the responsible person had routine inspection process that was being implemented robustly, and they were doing the test of the switch every month, and when I did my independent test, everything worked perfectly, I wouldn't mark up the risk level on the grounds that, well, you know, you're doing a great job monthly, I wish it was weekly, okay? None of this applies to Grenfell Tower. Okay, there's no evidence of robust testing of the switch, in my opinion. I don't understand. I just, you know, Mr. Todd has his views for all the reasons he has his views. I'm probably just a little bit more boring in the sense that I read the lift standard. Very competent people have written it. They say to test that particular switch weekly, and I think it's for very good reason.
Now, Mr. Todd also suggested that monthly testing of the fireman's switch would be adequate, and he considered monthly testing a much more pragmatic period. That's day 167, page 189, lines 11 to 13. Are we to take it from the evidence you've just given that you disagree with that?
No, I think that's if it's being done, which it was not being done at Grenfell. You know, we're not in some fine line in matters around Grenfell that you know, they were testing the switch monthly, and I've been really critical because it wasn't weekly. That's not relevant to Grenfell. I think it's weekly. If I was working with a responsible person and they had a really consistent, well-implemented programme of testing monthly, I wouldn't rank the risk level up so high, and I wouldn't severely criticise them. If it's being done properly, which it was not at Grenfell Tower.
But that wouldn't that be a departure from the standard, which requires weekly testing?
It would be a departure, yes. And if a fire risk assessor is going to agree to a departure, it has to be for an explicable reason, if you will.
Right.
I think if someone's doing something very well consistently every month, as distinct from every week, I would be happy to contemplate the meaning of that. But that's not relevant to Grenfell Tower.
Mr. Todd's view, the basis of his view, and I'm summarising, is that the switch isn't likely to fail week by week, and there's no point sending somebody across London to test a switch that is unlikely to fail, and therefore, simply as a matter of period, it was adequate and pragmatic to test the switch monthly and not weekly. Would you agree with that?
No,
Just simply.
No, does it won't fail? How do you know when it's going to fail? I mean, that's the whole problem, isn't it? If I was going to agree to it monthly, what I'm doing is allowing an extra 3 weeks where it may have failed. That's the judgment I'm going to make. So
does it come to this, that you disagree with Mr. Todd on his explanation as to why monthly is okay and instead of weekly? But you would go with monthly without raising the risk level, provided you were satisfied that there was a good reason to do so and that other measures were in place. So I think, as you're telling me, Mr. Todd's explanation of monthly on the grounds it won't have failed, I don't agree with. Right. Okay. A responsible person having a great set of management procedures in place where that test is, without fail, checked every month, I would find it very, I would be wary about, really criticising them for that. Okay, and I think that's very different to what Mr. Todd has said, but he needs to confirm that. Yeah. Can I then show you what he told us on day 167 a little bit further on about the British standards? This is day 167, page 190, at line 20, over to page 191, line 7. At line 20, he's in the middle of an answer,
Yeah.
and he says, now, your question will probably be, sir, well, then why did you not say that in PAS 79 or the LGA guide? The answer is you're not allowed to write into one British standard something that conflicts with another British standard, even if what the other British standard says is stupid or, that's unfair, over the page, unduly onerous. So we had to write it into PAS 79, and if we'd written the LGA guide and we'd said every month, I'd be sitting here and you'd be saying, who were you to change the British standard to every month? But there's more of a recognition now, sir, that testing things in blocks of flats every week is probably unreasonable.
Yeah.
Question for you, Dr. Lane. Are you aware of any consensus or understanding within the fire safety industry up to June 2017 that the requirement for weekly tests of the lift firefighting switch the firefighting lift switch in blocks of flats was unreasonable?
No, I'm not. I mean,
No.
yeah. I think, the relevant British standard, there's a different reason for the weekly, monthly and annual activities, and I think they're for very good reason, and I wouldn't understand why one would make them interchangeable. And that's Mr. Todd's kind of...
And given the requirement for weekly testing of the switch was included both in the LGA guide, which I haven't shown you, and the PAS 79 guide, which I have, would you have expected a reasonably competent fire risk assessor to have recommended that the duty holder undertake weekly testing?
Yeah, I would, that he's checked that they're doing it.
Yes.
Not just say, please do it, that the job is to check that it's happening, and that's why it's really important to observe it for yourself as well.
And is it your opinion, based on what you've told us, that the reasonably competent fire risk assessor would only be free to recommend a frequency which differed from the published guidance or standard for good reasons?
Yeah. So if in the case of Mr. Stokes, who had great access to the buildings because he was there for several years, every 2 years or every year you can witness the reliability of the fire risk management system that's delivering a tested lift switch. The only reason for it is so that it performs it performs the right way in the event of a fire. So if that's consistent all the time, I wouldn't get into a massive debate with anyone. That is not what happened at Grenfell Tower.
No. And in your report, we don't need to go to this part of it, Chapter 7, paragraph 7.8.78, page 82, you indicated, tell me if this is wrong, that it would have been appropriate for a suitably trained member of the TMO's staff to have undertaken the weekly test of the operation of the fire lift switch.
Yeah, that's it, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, we've heard evidence from some of the estate managers, the ESAs on that.
Yes.
Mr. Stedman, Paul Stedman, confirmed that they never tested the fire control switch in the lifts at Grenfell Tower at all.
That's correct, yeah.
Would you agree that the normal and accepted standards, well, the normal standards required Mr. Stokes to understand the routine inspections and tests on the lifts?
Absolutely, because it's one of the outputs of a fire risk management system, and your risk level is wrong if you don't understand the condition of the fire risk management system and the various procedures it's relying on, and routine inspections are a really important manifestation of a functioning fire risk management system.
And would it follow from that the fire risk assessor should understand both who was undertaking those tests and inspections and the scope of those tests and inspections, and to record those accurately in the FRA?
Yes.
Can I then turn to the topic of flat entrance doors, which is a completely new topic? Mr. Chairman, it's terribly early for the break, so I'm going to make some progress on this.
I was going to say, I think that would be better.
First of all, can we look at this question of FD30 as against FD30S?
Yeah.
Is there a difference between a door and a door set when it comes to resistance to fire?
The door set is, the door set is the whole assembly, and that's what's required to perform in a fire.
Right. You laughed at my question. I wonder
No,
whether
it's such a hard. Some of these questions sound really simple, but they're fiendish, and in this environment, sometimes it's a bit. Ooh.
Okay.
Yeah, so sorry, that's just me. So
No,
it's
I was
the door
wondering.
set. Obviously, I'm now going to say to you, why are you asking me about the two different things?
Help me, it
Yeah.
sounded to me like an incoherent question, because if I've understood the position correctly,
That's why I thought
the
Dr.
door
Lane
and
was
the
laughing.
door set is a piece, so to speak.
Yeah,
It all works as one.
Exactly. So the door set is the whole thing. The door leaf is just. I'm kind of frantically looking around. Is
Yeah,
the
it's a
bit
bit that
that's
moves, isn't
moving?
it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. She said expert.
Try again,
Yeah.
Mr. Mills.
The chairman has characterised the question as incoherent. And it
I
may
thought,
be,
I
but-
thought it sounded incoherent.
well,
Maybe able to persuade me that it wasn't.
But if you could hear it, can you explain briefly the characteristics that are necessary for a door set
Yeah.
to be considered FD30?
Can I explain the characteristics? Yes, so the door set, so the frame, the leaf, the door closer, the door opener, the latch, or the glass if there's glass, all the different components of the door together. And also, depending on the manufacturer, there will be intumescent seals around the leaf or on the frame, and also behind some of the ironmongery. It depends on the manufacturer of the door. So they are kind of well-known classic elements of a door set that, once that set has been tested, should give FD30. And then to get the S, there's an additional, it's called a cold smoke seal, and that's subject to a cold smoke test.
You say that's subject to a cold smoke test.
Sorry, I should have said, sorry, excuse me. The whole assembly with the smoke seal is subject to the cold smoke test.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So that's the key point I wanted to tease out. Is it the case that where FD30S doors are required to be installed,
Yes.
you can't simply take an FD30 door, fit cold smoke seals to the door or to the frame, and then treat it as an FD30S door?
Correct. There's two tests needed, and you don't need me to say. I mean, the door manufacturing industry are very clear. They've lots of very helpful publications about the significance
Right.
of that.
And
Yeah.
is this right to meet the specifications of FD30S?
Yes.
The door set
Yes.
has to be tested for ambient or cold smoke leakage in accordance with British Standard 476 Part 31.1.
Yeah. Yes. Yes, that's correct. Sorry, I'm trying to remember the British standard. Yes, that's correct.
Now, let's look at Mr. Stokes. Can we go to CST 402660? This is a letter sent by Mr. Stokes to Janice Ray on the 10th of November 2010. Subject, the replacement of fire doors to some entrance doors of residential flats. And the title under that, criteria for prioritising the fitting of new entrance doors to flats. And then at the foot of the page, he set out some options, 3 options, in fact, in total. Option 1, replace the old door and frame, the door set, with a new 30-minute fire-rated door set.
Oh, sorry, you're down at the bottom. Okay,
bottom
sorry,
of the
excuse
page,
me.
bottom of the screen.
Yeah.
Replace the old door and frame, the door set, with a new 30-minute fire-rated door set, incorporating intumescent strips and cold smoke seals, FD30S, with a self-closing device.
Yeah.
The name of the page, 2, replace the old door with a new 30-minute fire-rated door, inserted in the old frame, incorporating intumescent strips and cold smoke seals in the new door, FD30S, with a self-closing device.
Yeah.
3, fit intumescent strips, if not fitted, and cold smoke seals in the existing door and a self-closing device to the door.
Yeah.
Those are the 3 options. Did Mr. Stokes correctly advise, was he right, that the specification of those replacement doors should be FD30S?
So the overall performance,
Yes.
yes, should be FD30S. So
Yes.
that's correct, yes.
And which of these three options would deliver an FD30S door?
Just go back to the other page.
Go to page 1, please. Option 1.
I feel slightly like I'm at an exam now, but I think reading this English here,
Yeah.
replacing the door and frame with a new, he's got it there. The rated door and then the cold smoke seals FD30S. He doesn't say anything about testing, but that could be the right option.
Right, yeah, I see. Now, can we then go to CST 30130074? This is a letter written in March the next year, 7th of March 2011,
Yeah,
updated a few days later on the 10th of March 2011, as you can see,
yeah.
after a meeting with Simon Throp. And he says, 3 paragraphs down, on the Manse Master Door Limited Company website, it states that their doors, quote, meet the requirements of Part M of the building regulations, and fire check versions have also been successfully tested to BS 476 Part 22, close quotes. Question 1, can it please be confirmed that the doors that are to be fitted under the contract are the 30-minute fire doors FD30
Yeah,
version, and could the company forward all the relevant documentation to confirm this?
yeah.
In the specifications and information, there appears to be no mention of self-closing devices being fitted to the apartment entrance doors, nor that the doors will have intumescent seals.
Yeah.
Should Mr. Stokes have asked for confirmation that the doors were FD30S doors?
Yes, because that's the performance. Well, yes, he should have, yes.
Now, if we go to page 2, in the last paragraph on that page, you can see that Mr. Stokes had received confirmation underneath his signature, updated information after 10th March meeting with J. Ray and S. Throp. Simon confirmed that the replacement doors would have self-closers and cold smoke seals fitted to them. Also, the letterboxes would be fire rated.
Yeah.
We've seen no evidence that Mr. Stokes insisted that the doors or door sets were certified FD30S or tested to that standard following that confirmation. And my question is, would you have expected Mr. Stokes to have raised that with the TMO? Raised the fact that he'd seen no confirmation from Manse Master Door that the door sets had passed the relevant tests so as to make them FD30S.
Yes, because in this particular case, for the people who haven't read all around this, he had been asked for a specific view about the door performance. It wasn't within a fire risk assessment moment. He had been asked to give advice about the door, so he did need to make that clear. And he did need to check, yes.
Right, thank you. Now, can I show you what he said in his evidence? And the background to what I'm about to show you is that in May 2011, he wrote to Janice Ray and referred to the doors being fitted as FD30 doors. I don't think we need to look at the letter. If I can show you the transcript of Mr. Stokes' evidence at day 138, page 54. I'd like to pick it up at line 20. And at line 20, the question is asked, so after the trial door installation, it seems that you provided your opinion on whether the door or doors complied with the requirements of the fire safety order and approved document B, yes? Correct. And you confirmed that they were FD30, yes? Can we go over the page? Line 1, answer. From the information I was given, yes. Question, and that was contrary to your advice, wasn't it, of the requirements for the doors which you gave before the installation, which was that, at least according to the parts of ADB that you highlighted in green, they should be FD30S. I disagree. The doors are FD30, and as it says in this document, so it says here, the door fitted was an FD30, and then it says there's fitted reinforced frame, the door was fitted with self-closing device, intumescent and cold smoke seals, so therefore that makes it the S. So you're referring there, are you, to lower down the paragraph, correct? Which is the paragraph we just looked at. It doesn't say anything about FD30S in there, does it? You don't refer to that. No, but it says on there, intumescent and cold smoke seals in a fire-rated letterbox. Now, this is him explaining, in effect, why he considered his note that the door installed, FD30, was not, contrary to his earlier advice, that the door needed to be an FD30S. Is his explanation correct?
Well, what document was it you and he were looking at?
We were looking at the last paragraph of the letter.
Oh, of his
showed-
letter?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well then, what was your question again?
Well, perhaps we should have it up at the...
No, it's okay. I understand now. I thought maybe you were talking about the brochure or some of the other documents.
No,
I had.
no, the confirmation letter, the confirmation that Mr. Stokes received from Janice Ray and Mr. Simon Throp,
Yeah.
that the doors would have self-closers and cold smoke seals fitted to them.
Yeah, so they could have been FD30S, but he needed to know that they had the 2 tests done and that they were,
Right.
I'm going to say, compliant or sold, because they're sold, well, they're meant to be sold as tested, yeah.
But can I
We
just
need to understand,
sorry,
don't we,
yeah.
that the doors that are supplied are not themselves individually tested. They're made to a pattern that's been tested.
Exactly, they're made to a pattern, and so the specific door has a specific pattern that has been proven through test that unique pattern works.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
there's a prototype,
Yeah,
presumably. Or-
that's yes, yeah.
Yeah, I'm just going back then to the transcript in light of that answer, and just to be completely clear, where he says at line 7, the doors are FD30, and as it says in this document, the door fitted FD30, then it says fitted reinforced frame, the door was fitted with self-closing device, intumescent and cold smoke seals, so therefore that makes it the S. Is Mr. Stokes' explanation that the simple fitting with the self-closing device, intumescent and cold smoke seals, is what makes it the S?
No.
No. And is his explanation that by fitting the self-closer and the intumescent cold smoke seals to the door in this pattern of doors,
Yes.
it turns the door into an 30S?
No.
One, is that an explanation which a reasonably competent fire risk assessor might give?
They very well might, but it would be wrong.
Right.
So your point is that unless it's made to the pattern that's been tested,
Yeah.
it's not an S.
It,
But he might have been a bit sloppy in his use of language here, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly. So the cold smoke seal, so the right cold smoke seal in the approved door should get you the S rating in the cold smoke test.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
The intumescent and the fire rated letterbox are all to do with getting the baseline FD30.
right.
The heat. So that's to do with heat.
Yes.
The cold smoke seal is a cold, different test.
Yes.
Yeah.
But exactly. And what I'm trying to drive at, well, regardless of the question of pattern,
Yes.
is it right that you can take an FD30 door set, put some cold smoke seals in it, and then call it an FD30S?
No, you can't.
No, you
and
can't.
there's an obsessive attention to detail in the door industry because of how it's difficult to, without very careful design, FD30 and FD30S require very specific detailing, not any old thing, I think is the best thing to say.
Right. And is that because in order to supply, or in order to call a door set an FD30S, the type of door set you're selling or supplying has to be tested to BS 476 part 31.1?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, towards the end of 2011...
Do you think we've got to a convenient...
Oh, we have, yes, Mr. Chairman.
I think you ought to have a break at this stage. So we'll take the break. We'll come back at 25 to 4, please.
Yep.
Again, no discussion about your evidence.
No problem.
Thank you very much. Right, 25 to 4. Mr. Miller, I think I raised this with you before. Do we not have the paperwork for the supply of these doors, which shows what was actually ordered?
I've asked that question a number of times. The answer is what we have is what has been seen. We have no other paperwork. You know, the
But
document.
at some point, I at least would be interested to see what paperwork we have.
Well, I'll come back to you after the break with I hope, a chapter and verse answer.
Thank you very much. Good. 25 to 4, please. Thank you. Would you ask Dr. Lane to come back in, please? Thank you.
Okay, I'll look at it.
All right, Dr. Lane, ready to
Yep,
carry on?
yep.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Now, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Towards the end of 2011, Dr. Lane, following the flat entrance doors installation programme, it appears that Mr. Stokes became aware that some of the self-closing devices for some of the doors installed during the programme were presenting problems. And you cover this in your report at Chapter 8. And can we just look at that? Can we go to BLARP 25027, page 314? You pick this up at paragraph 13.8.7, and you say there, when Mr. Stokes issued his 2012 fire risk assessment on 20th of November 2012, 102 of the final total of 106 manse master doors had been installed in Grenfell Tower, and you give a reference for that. And then you go on to say at 13.8.8, Mr. Stokes made no reference to the recurring fault he identified with the manse master door self-closers, nor whether all of the main flat front entrance doors in Grenfell Tower had been remediated by a manse master door. This was a serious omission, as if at that time the self-closers were non-functional. It already posed a potential risk to life of the relevant persons, and those doors could not be relied upon to act as the collective protective measure, except in some circumstances. Why do you think it was incumbent on Mr. Stokes to have recorded in his FRA the recurring faults he had identified with the manse master door doors?
Because the fault that he became aware of meant the door wasn't offering the protection being relied upon in the building.
And if we go on to go to BLARP 25040, page 70. Let's look at what you say at that page in Chapter 11. Paragraph 22.3.39, you say, first, I've not been able to find any evidence that Mr. Stokes nor any employee of KCTMO ever investigated the performance of the fire doors in Grenfell Tower to assure themselves they had indeed been repaired as manse master door had originally claimed.
Yeah.
When you say investigate the performance, what did you mean?
I mean that if you're aware of a fault with a protection measure that reduces or removes its performance, you know, in the case of man's master door, they said they were going back to replace the faulty items. I think that you need to go and check to make sure that has happened. That's what I meant.
Right. And you say check. Do you mean check in the building or check with the TMO?
Who? The risk assessor?
Yes.
Oh, I think that both, because the repair works needed to be triggered by the team. You know, the repair works. Sorry, needed to have been. The TMO staff needed to know the repairs that the contractor claimed to be making were being carried out. And I think the risk assessor should have been sufficiently curious when he was the one actually who seems to have known, he certainly knew before Miss Ray, when it came to his next risk assessment, when he was inspecting some doors, he should have satisfied himself that the repairs had been made, the closers were working.
Right. And it was the timing for that when he did his next risk assessment?
Yes.
Or before that?
The timing of that. Do you mean should he have generally checked the door closers because it might be 2 years before he did the risk assessment? If he personally wasn't going to do that, and it wasn't necessarily his job to go off and do an inspection outside his risk assessment, he absolutely needed to inform the KCTMO of the urgency that any person checked if the faulty closers were being repaired so the door offered protection. So he had to warn or do something. In this case, I think it was to warn. And then when his time for his risk assessment came, yes, he needed to satisfy himself also. So it's two things.
And would not doing any of those things that you've just referred to fall below the standards of the reasonably competent fire risk assessor?
Yes, and the standards expected of a responsible person whose responsibilities for a fire risk management system.
Yes, thank you. Now, let's go then more centrally to the topic of checking doors during inspections, during FRA inspections.
Yeah.
Can we go back, please, to BLARP 250/27, and this time go to page 303, chapter 8, and look at paragraph 13.3.29. And it says here, the LGA guide is therefore clear that at least a sample, and you've quoted it above, at least a sample assessment of flat front entrance doors is required, and the need to gain entry to those flats to undertake the assessment. Now, you have quoted it, but to be clear, let's look at what the LGA guide says. HOM 3045964, page 45. And I'd like to look at section 35 on that page. Where we see type 1 and lower down type 2. Type 1, common parts only, non-destructive. This is the kind of risk assessment that is identified, or type of risk assessment identified by the LGA guide. And it says, under type 1, in the second paragraph, the inspection of the building is non-destructive, but as well as considering the arrangements for means of escape and so forth, the fire risk assessment includes examination of at least a sample of flat entrance doors. You see that? So when we see your opinion that I've just shown you at paragraph 13.3.29, was that the basis of your opinion?
To do a sample?
Yes.
Well, the basis of my opinion is also, I suppose, what I do.
Right.
Is that, if that's fair to say? Yeah.
Would you agree that the inspection of the sample of flat entrance doors would require the fire risk assessor to gain access to the relevant flats in order to examine the presence of or the state of the door closer?
The door closer and other parts of the door that are important to offer protection.
I was going to ask you, and cold smoke seals, for example.
And we talked about the intumescent strips. There's various protective measures around the closed.
So cold
door.
smoke seals, intumescent strips,
and
the firebox,
the
fire
condition, the general
letterbox.
condition, if you want to say, of the frame and the leaf.
In practice, what kind of percentage of flat entrance doors was considered suitable and sufficient in the trade at the time to constitute a proper sample, as contemplated by the LGA?
Yeah, so I don't know about a numeric percentage, so that, that it's agreed it's 5, it's agreed it's 10, anything more or less. So there's no number, in my opinion, that's set out. And it is a decision that has to be made by the risk assessor, normally as a function of the overall condition of the building or their knowledge of various things about the building.
Right, I see. So it's a building-specific sample.
Yeah, I think.
Based on judgment, is it?
Yes. I think that's the best way of describing it. There's no golden rule, as they call it, about a sample number that absolutely guarantees it's the correct sample. Sorry, apologies. Yeah.
Yes. Mr. Todd's evidence was that 5% was sufficient if all the doors were the same.
Yeah.
Although he thought it was on the slim side, but not unduly.
Yeah, so
Did you quarrel with that, or?
So I understand what that means. So this is the thing about the condition of the building. So if you take the case of Grenfell Tower, they had a new set of doors installed. One would hope they were to the right standards. They might be in good condition. You might decide to inspect one door per floor. She said frantically, thinking, I think Mr. Todd's, what did you say, 5% or 10%?
5%.
Yeah, I think that's 6 doors, isn't it, at Grenfell?
6.
Which is less than 1 per floor. I think it's about 1 every 3 stories. So that is on the slim side. Yeah.
And except where a flat entrance door is identified as deficient in some way.
Yeah.
Mr. Stokes doesn't record in his FRAs the specific doors that he checked,
Yeah.
nor the percentage of doors inspected on any given occasion.
Yeah.
We know that as a fact.
Yeah.
Would that be normal?
Is it normal?
Is it normal? Is it normal not to record in your FRA the specific doors that you've checked?
I think if you've gone to the trouble of inspecting a door, the average competent person would write that down. Because, yeah.
Yes. And would you write down the percentage of doors inspected if you had inspected a sample?
Okay. I think if you've given a log of doors you've inspected, that's perfectly adequate. I don't know if you need to go on and do a mathematical assessment and decide if that's an acceptable sample.
No.
But it's important to record where you've inspected, because the point about sampling is if you've done your 5% and you're finding consistent failures, your sampling, your inspection needs to go up, or the responsible person now needs to make other arrangements to start to inspect further. That's my experience of sampling.
But I think you agree that it would be good practice for a reasonably competent fire risk assessor to record which particular doors they had inspected as part of the sample.
Absolutely.
Would it be bad practice or unreasonable for the fire risk assessor not to do so?
Is it unreasonable?
Would it fall below the standards expected of the reasonably competent fire risk assessor?
Yeah, I think so, because again, the location of faulty or defective fire doors impacts the risk level to persons in that area, so it's important to know where they are.
What should a competent fire risk assessor do if they tried to get access to flats to carry out their sample but could not access a sufficiently representative number?
Phone the responsible person and come back the next day, or make them come and help you.
Right. Would it be normal and acceptable for a fire risk assessor only to check and record in their FRA those flat front doors where they had seen a defect, such as a hole or a non-compliant letterbox?
I think you should record both. So I think you should record both, because you're building up a picture of the overall condition of an important protective measure in the building.
When you say both, what do you mean?
Sorry, you said was it defective only. So I think you should record all doors you've inspected, whether or not you found defects or not. You can make clear the flat entrance doors on level 11 were in really good condition, but for some reason the flat entrance doors at level 8 are in a different condition, because there's a trend emerging there that needs further investigation.
Right. But would it be normal and acceptable for a fire risk assessor only to look at doors where there was an evident, manifest problem with it from the outside?
So that's normally a reasonable starting position.
Right.
Okay.
But not the totality?
No.
No. Would it be normal and acceptable for a fire risk assessor never to identify any problems with flat entrance doors which would only be apparent from an internal inspection?
Can you just say that again, please?
Yes. Would it be acceptable? Would it be reasonable for a fire risk assessor not to identify any problems with flat entrance doors which could only be apparent from an internal inspection? We've tried a different way.
Yeah, can you? Sorry, I'm just getting a bit confused.
If a fire risk assessor was going around a building trying to do his sample, would it be normal practice, or would it be reasonably acceptable practice for them to ignore any doors which didn't have a sign of any damage on the outside, even though in fact the door closers may not work from an internal inspection?
Yeah, okay, I see what you mean. So the fault is hidden and they assume because they've stood on the outside only.
Yes.
Is that reasonable way to start? No, because so you start with a small sample, and then if you're going to have to build up to something extensive as a function of what you've seen, if you only ever stand outside the fire door and make a judgment on harm potential on that basis, you can't do that without looking on all around the door. You can't see the protective measures fully from the lobby.
So does that tell us that the reasonably competent fire risk assessor would, or certainly should, as part of their sample, look inside the door and look inside the door leaf to check the efficacy of the protection measures,
Yeah, so
even if there's no sign of apparent damage to the door?
They should, yes, because it can be hidden. It's a hidden feature of that protection measure.
Now, turning to the doors which Mr Stakes identified as presenting a risk or a hazard in his significant findings and action plans, I'll show you three of those. First of all, the November 2012 FRA action plan, CST 403083, at page 3, item 12B. Hi, there are holes in flat entrance doors of flats numbered 166 and 202. In number 166's case, this is where a lock has been removed from the door. These are original doors and they are now not 30-minute fire rated doors. I would recommend that these two flats entrance doors are repaired and replaced so that they are 30-minute fire rated doors fitted with self-closing devices complying with all the requirements of the building regulations. And then the next one, at CST 403069, page 4, this is June 2016, is action plan at page 4, item 12G. If you could just blow that up a bit more, foot of the page. The flat entrance door of flat 24 is damaged with the letterbox missing, and then you could see the recommended actions to be taken there. And then at CST 403069, page 5, so the next page in this document, item 12H, high priority. The flat entrance door of flat 112 is being replaced. This new door is not marked as a fire-rated door and does not have a self-closing device fitted to it. Cold smoke seals are fitted. That's 12H, and you can see the recommendations for that. Now, if we could look at your report in the light of that, can we please go to BLARP 25027, page 304, and let's look at paragraph 13.3.35 in chapter 8. You say there, Mr Stokes, Mr Stokes therefore undertook an examination of a sample of flat entrance doors, apparently in accordance with the minimum requirements of the LGA guide. Now, having heard the evidence of Mr Stokes, and by showing you the documents in his action plans I've just shown you, is it still your view that Mr Stokes undertook an examination of a sample of flat entrance doors, apparently in accordance with the minimum requirements of the LGA guide?
I think, do you mean because based on, I think there's 3 or 4 doors there, you flicked through that very quickly. Are you asking me on the basis of the limited number of doors he recorded in those risk assessments, do I consider that to be a sample? Is that what you mean?
Yes, that's another way of putting it.
It's a very small sample.
Is it a suitable and sufficient sample?
Okay, so that's a very different question, and the answer is no.
Right, thank you.
If you've got roughly, I'm not sure precisely, 120 flats,
Yeah,
120 front doors,
Yes.
a 10% sample isn't very many in any event, is it? It's only 12 doors.
Yeah, exactly. So probably
And
just to so what I start with is I do the stair. What we do is you do the stair door and one door. You might start with one stair door, one flat entrance door. But you have to be very mindful of the conditions around you, and you may very quickly decide that that is not sufficient. Okay, so if you do one door per floor in Grenfell Tower starting at the ground, you're up at 24. If you do ground up, I know there's no flats down there. There were no flats at ground. You're very quickly at 24 doors. It's not time consuming to inspect a door either. Yeah. So this is the danger of a numeric sample. Yeah. Anyway, sorry. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and I think this comes back. Is this right?
Yeah.
Comes back to your answer earlier that the size of sample is a matter of judgment based on what you know about the building.
Yeah, it is. And the layout of the building, the number of doors, the conditions in the lobby, your understanding of the fire risk management system. Are you confident routine inspections are occurring? So there's a lot of different factors that allow you to decide there is a consistency in a building, or there's lots of inconsistencies, and so you need to increase your sample to satisfy yourself that you're making the right assessment of risk to the relevant persons. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, can we look at your report at page 321 within this same section, chapter 8, and look at paragraph 13.12.13?
Yeah.
You say there, as a result,
Yeah.
perhaps I should show you the previous paragraph.
No,
In neither of his April 2016 and June 2016 fire risk assessment
Yeah.
did Mr Stokes record significant findings relating to the disconnection of self-closers,
Yeah.
nor the non-compliant doors to the protected stair.
Yeah.
And the evidence shows he knew of substantial problems with the fire doors at Grenfell Tower, as I've explained above. As a result, Mr Stokes made no assessment of the impact of any of the known deficiencies in these collective protective measures on the safety of relevant persons. This may be a rather broad question, but what was it that required Mr Stokes to make such an assessment?
Well, I mean, he was in a position of great knowledge that some of us mightn't be in on first arrival. He knew there are problems with the stair door. That's all dealt with in my report. He knew, for example, the self-closers had been removed by different parties. So the consequence of that reduction in protection level, the whole point of a risk assessment is you factor in that reduction in protection, and it impacts your final risk level unless you're providing temporary control or you're agreeing a time frame for it to be repaired. So the more defective flat entrance doors and stair doors there are, the less internal compartmentation is provided to the relevant persons.
In your opinion, was Mr Stokes required to factor in to his overall risk assessment for Grenfell Tower his findings that he had made or seen in relation to the disconnection of self-closers and non-compliant doors to the protected stair?
Yes, that's exactly the activity of a fire risk assessor doing a risk assessment.
And would failure to do so fall below the standards of the reasonably competent fire risk assessor?
Yes, in my opinion.
Can we then talk about maintenance of flat entrance doors and self-closing devices? Can we start with chapter 4 of your report, BLARP 25030, page 45, and I want to go to paragraph 4.2.1 in there, please. You say there, and this is under the heading guidance on the scope and frequency of routine inspections.
Yeah.
Based on my assessment of the guidance documents, there is a degree of variation in the recommended frequency of routine inspections, although all guidance documents are clear on the need to check the self-closing function of the fire doors. Would you agree with this proposition that after July 2011, when the LGA guidance was published, a responsible person was required to carry out inspections of flat entrance doors in accordance with the requirements of paragraphs 82.3 and 82.4 of the LGA guide? And I'll show you those if we need to see them.
I'm probably struggling with the word requirement. Leaving that
let me
aside.
put the question differently. Would you expect a responsible person to carry out inspections of flat entrance doors in accordance with the guidance contained in those paragraphs?
Yeah, because I think the LGA guide is actually particularly clear about self-closers, and from memory, they're one of the few things that are associated with the word priority.
Yes. And you recall, I think, that the LGA guide recommends inspections of self-closing devices on doors on a 6-monthly basis.
Yes, yeah.
Can you help? What would count as a good reason for a responsible person not doing 6 monthly inspections of flat entrance doors?
Good reason not to. No, I can't think of a good reason not to do that.
Can we?
Well, sorry, can we just make it clear
Yeah.
what we're talking about?
Yeah.
I think Mr. Millett's asking you to consider that on the basis that every flat front door will be checked by being opened and allowed to close under its own power. Is that right?
Well, yes. We need to look at the. Maybe better if there's a confusion, we look at the.
I
the
thought you
actual-
meant
Well,
more.
we can in a minute, but
Yeah.
if that is what's being suggested,
Yeah.
it might be said by, for example, the TMO that to check in that way every front door of every flat in 650 buildings
Exactly.
every 6 months would be disproportionately heavy on manpower time.
Exactly. So if I can speak in a theoretical sense, if I was working with a responsible person and they were doing, a marvellous set of checks every 12 months, and you found during your risk assessment, functioning fire doors consistently, you're back to that judgment again. You're going to think very carefully about what that means. Their fire risk management system is delivering performing fire doors, though they're only doing an inspection every 12 months, okay? That's substantially better than doing nothing or failing to achieve an unrealistic 6 monthly goal. So it's about the outcomes and being careful of the outcomes. Is that okay? I don't want to, people will say I've declared a new rule for frequency, and that's not what I'm trying to do.
Let me try.
It sounds to me as though you would, well, tell me whether you would
Yeah.
accept the proposition that the extent of your inspections may have to be tailored to the cost of carrying them out and the burden of
Yeah.
how frequently you do
The
it.
burden of implementation.
And
Yeah.
you're always going to have whatever the nature of the system,
Yeah.
there is always going to be a risk that some will not be functioning because they'll slip through the net.
Exactly. And I think, so again, now you're back again to, let's say, the overall condition of the particular building stock or the particular buildings in that stock, okay? So if there are new doors, an annual inspection with a bit of a spot check. But if you're aware of a property where the doors are so fundamentally, let's say, not acceptable, that's a different matter again.
Yeah.
Okay, so all the time there is a judgment required as a function of the risk to the relevant persons, and your fire risk management system and your fire risk assessor, you're working in that kind of integrated loop all the time. Okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Can I just then pause that a little bit, if we can? Can we look at HOM 30459664 and look at page 125, which is where we find paragraphs 82.3 and 82.4 of the LGA guide. Because it is here that we find the guidance on inspection
Yeah.
under paragraph or section 82. And under fire resisting doors at 82.3, it says, good practice is to inspect timber fire resisting door sets on a 6 monthly basis as part of a programme of planned preventive maintenance. These inspections are aimed at identifying defects such as, and then the first bullet point is missing or ineffective self-closing devices. And then underneath that at 82.4, flat entrance doors should be included within this programme. And then there's something about leasehold flats, which we needn't look at necessarily for this purpose. So it's clearly recommending inspections on a 6 monthly
Yes.
basis as good practice.
Yes.
My question was, what would count as a good reason for a responsible person not doing 6 monthly inspections? In other words, departing from the 6 monthly periodicity.
Yeah, I think
Can you answer that?
I think I've answered that question now, and we've had that discussion about overall condition of the building, overall quality, of aspects of the fire risk management system.
Would it
Okay.
be a good reason not to do 6 monthly checks that you didn't have the resources to do so across your estate?
If you didn't have the resources. If you don't have the resources to check the fire doors, you can't factor them in as robustly into the risk assessment as one might if one was able to carry out the checks needed. So by making that decision based on resource, you're back to expand. You know, you're moving the goalposts or whatever you want to say. You're now increasing the potential for harm to relevant persons, and you have to balance that maybe with other control measures in the building.
Well, I mean, would it be reasonable for a responsible person to say, I'm not going to do 6 monthly inspections because I haven't got the money and I haven't got the manpower, I'm only going to do them annually?
As I've already said, if they're doing a thorough job annually and the consistency in protection is being delivered that way, I wouldn't criticise that strongly. But can I just say, I don't know how to phrase this. Some measures are so important, you have to find the resource and the money, don't you? Otherwise, you have to start to think, it's like layers of an onion, you have to start to understand the consequences of that. All my buildings are stay put, but I can't afford to look at the fire doors or check the compartmentation. So there are consequences to all these decisions, and they all have to be added together at the end to give a risk ranking for that building.
And you say some measures are so important you have to find the resources and the money. Were self-closing devices to flat front doors at Grenfell Tower measures of the importance that you had to find the resource and the money?
I think that self-closers are widely acknowledged as being highly significant in high-rise residential buildings because of the high degree of compartmentation that is essential to the stay-put strategy.
So is that a yes? That self-closing devices are one of those measures?
So life sometimes isn't simple enough where I can just say yes here. Sometimes I would love to say yes and I can't say yes, okay? But you might decide I can't afford to repair all my broken self-closers, so actually I'm going to have to change the evacuation strategy for my building.
I see. Thank you. Now, looking at the question of inspections without regard to the period, would it count, well, would there be any good reason for a responsible person to do no regular inspections of door closers?
No.
Thank you. Now, if we go to your report, BLARP 25030, page 47, chapter 4, we look at paragraph 4.2.8 and 4.2.9. Just show you what you say there. You say the self-closing devices are a critical component of the fire door in order to maintain compartmentation in support of a stay-put strategy by safeguarding the means of escape. Regular inspection on the self-closing devices are therefore important, especially since they are prone to wear and tear on flat entrance doors and doors leading to the stairs due to their location on the main circulation routes. And my question is a simple one. Who would you expect to be carrying out the regular inspections?
The responsible person.
And when you look at the fire risk assessor's role, in the context of inspection and maintenance of flat entrance doors and self-closing devices in particular, do you agree that the role of the fire risk assessor is to monitor and to assess the physical state of the repair of the doors and the door sets, including those self-closing devices, and the adequacy of the system of maintenance, and then use those findings to determine the level of risk?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Would you agree that the inspections of flat entrance doors undertaken by a fire risk assessor as part of their fire risk assessment should not be a component of the maintenance and inspection system implemented by the responsible person?
Well, that's that's a really interesting question. Yes, if by agreement, or else no. So there has to be clarity on, I'm just aware, sometimes a risk assessor is asked to do a very thorough inspection of every single fire door for maintenance purposes. But it's not a matter of course, and it's not implicit in the risk assessment process, no.
Thank you. So,
Yeah.
thank you. So to put it another way, you agree that normally he's there to assess the duty holder's inspection regime
Exactly.
and not to provide it.
Exactly, yeah.
Now, the evidence of Janice Ray was that the TMO did not implement a 6-monthly system of inspection of the flat entrance doors as recommended by the LGA guide, largely because of what she called resources and difficulties with access. Is the failure to implement the recommended programme of inspection of flat entrance doors, as per the guidance we've looked at, a matter that you would expect a reasonably competent fire risk assessor to have identified during the course of their fire risk assessment?
Yes.
And if there's the evidence, well, if Mr. Stokes didn't identify that
Yes.
as a failure on the part of the TMO in any of his fire risk assessments, did that omission affect the suitability and sufficiency of his FRAs, at least for Grenfell Tower?
Yes, if he didn't he didn't explain that it elevates the risk.
Did he anywhere?
No, never.
Now, I've asked you some questions about clause 20 of PAS 79 earlier on,
Yeah.
and the fact that work recommended in the original plan of action not being completed needs to be identified. We covered that at some length. We saw clause 20 on page 61, there's no need to go to it, which says work that has not been completed needs to be identified.
Yeah.
Can I just examine with you some specific instances
Yeah.
where Mr. Stokes' actual knowledge of the condition of flat entrance doors?
Yeah.
Let me give you 3 specific examples. Try and keep them in your head, and I'll take them slowly. Okay. First, July 2015,
Yeah.
Mr. Stokes is told that the self-closing device to flat 45 is missing.
Yeah.
In December 2015, he raises a concern with Janice Ray that residents of Grenfell Tower had told him that one of the caretakers had disconnected a number of
Yes.
self-closing devices.
Yes.
And thirdly, Mr. Stokes did not include that information in the next FRA, April 2016, nor confirm that the issues have been rectified in the interim.
Yeah.
Now, working on that assumed fact pattern, if
Yes.
I can, with you, you make a comment in your report at chapter 11, and I'll show it to you. BLARP 25040, page 71, paragraph 22.3.45. And you say this: I've not been able to find in the evidence that Mr. Stokes or any employee of the KCTMO ever investigated the performance of the fire doors in Grenfell Tower to assure themselves that self-closers removed by Mr. Dunley had then been replaced. And then if you go to the next paragraph,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, the next paragraph, but 47. Mr. Stokes did not record the issues that arose between fire risk assessment visits to Grenfell Tower, but more substantially, he did not attempt to confirm if the fire door self-closer issue had been resolved either before finalising his assessment of the risk level for Grenfell Tower. Right. Now, shown you both of those. Can you explain why you think that Carl Stokes should have recorded the issues that arose between his visits in his fire risk assessments?
Because they impact the harm potential to the relevant persons.
And does that explain why you think he should have attempted to confirm if the self-closer issues had been resolved by the time of his next FRA?
Yes.
Is it your opinion that he should specifically have checked those flat entrance doors that had been identified as deficient, at least when he came to do his next FRA?
Yeah, I mean, first, he should have been able to have been briefed by the responsible person. The situation had been closed out without him. And then, second, he needed to do certainly start with a limited independent check of some of the doors he was aware had not been functioning.
Would a reasonably competent fire risk assessor proceed on an assumption that if he told his client, the responsible person, that a self-closer was defective, it would be speedily fixed and he need concern himself no more with it?
The only way, only if there was other evidence that things were being speedily fixed and the responsible person had such a fire risk management system.
Right.
I've not seen such evidence when it comes to Grenfell Tower.
Thank you. That was my next question. Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Stokes explained that he didn't include the information about the condition of the flat entrance door to flat 45, Grenfell Tower, in his April 2016 FRA because it wasn't part of the FRA, but part of ad hoc advice to the TMO. Oh, yeah. That's what he told us at day 138, page 126.
Yeah, no.
Lines 18 to 21.
Yeah.
Would you endorse that approach?
No, I wouldn't at all.
Can you explain why not?
Because, I mean, it's a piece of information the risk assessor has, valuable information, and it needs to be dealt with in the risk assessment again, whether it's given ad hocly or not. Yeah.
So you would have expected Mr. Stokes to record in his April 2016 FRA his knowledge that self-closing devices had been removed or were missing since his last FRA in October 2014.
Yeah, and that he checked again that day and they were still gone.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Now, I want to turn to the next topic, which is the AOV system.
Yeah.
And when I say AOV system, I mean the system which was in place at Grenfell Tower before or up to 2016.
Yeah.
And not the new system, which is the subject of separate evidence and separate evidence from you, which I'm not going to go into. There's 10 minutes left on the clock, Mr. Chairman. If we can make a start on this topic, that would be helpful.
You have to keep going for 10 minutes?
We've got plenty. We're doing very well, so we could break at this point.
Yeah.
I'm in your
Am I
hands.
allowed to say it would be great to stop, but I don't want to sound rude or anything? But am I allowed to say that it would be great to stop, but I don't want to sound rude? Yeah.
I'll just check with Mr. Millett. Mr. Millett, if we stop now, are we safe to finish within tomorrow?
Very safe.
Very safe.
Well, in that case, I think we can grant you an indulgence. Right. We'll stop at that point.
Okay.
We'll resume, please, at 10 o'clock tomorrow.
That's fine. Thank you.
And again, no talking.
Don't worry. Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Mr. Millett. I just thought it right just to check that we weren't going to find ourselves in an embarrassing position tomorrow afternoon.
No, absolutely not. Well, that's hence the rather tentative invitation.
Well, it was unusual, I agree.
Good.
Thank you very much. Right, well, we shall stop there for the day and resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow, please.
Very good.
Thank you very much.